I'd like to thank Proven for sponsoring this video. Do your quilting blocks turn out small? Do you struggle to keep your points? Are you frustrated that your piecing skills are not improving? Then foundation paper piecing might be the technique for you. In this quilting tutorial, we will be covering the basics to get going, the tools that will make it easy, and of course my top tips for the best results. Plus, there's a free pattern download at the end. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And if you like what you see, please click that subscribe button. Before we go any further, this video is about FPP, Foundation Paper Piecing, which should not be confused with EPP, which is English Paper Piecing. And I've already covered that sewing technique in this video here. Foundation paper piecing is a quilting technique that allows you to sew precise, intricate designs by stitching fabric to a paper foundation. This method is fantastic for achieving complicated designs and irregular shapes that might be a challenge with traditional piecing. The paper acts as a guide and stabilizer for your fabric. Different paper piece patterns have different skill levels. Good beginner patterns are blocks unto themselves, like this tree block or the economy block. More advanced blocks have 2 or more segments that are sewn together to make one unit. In general, the more segments pattern has, the more challenging it will be. Now, the lighter the paper you use, the better. Photocopy paper is fine, but the lighter paper will be easier for your needle to punch through. And my first tip is there's no need for any expensive foundation paper piece paper. You might remember in my dollar store hacks part 2, I showed you that newsprint from a doodle pad is just as good as the expensive stuff. You cut it to the size that you need and you load it in your printer. And you might think that printing is the easy part, but honestly, this is a spot where so many quilters get tripped up. When you press print, you need to be careful that the scale setting is 100%. For some of you, it might mean that the scale to print box is not checked. And on the paper piece pattern, there is normally a scale that you check just to be sure. And if there is no scale, you just refer to the finished size of the block. This one's 4 inches by 6, and you just check the size there. You never, ever, ever miss this step. You gotta trust me on this one. Now, having ensured that your print settings are correct, your pattern still might be off slightly. So here's my next tip. Print all your pattern pieces on the same printer. Don't do some at home and some at the office, because that little difference can end up making a big difference when everything comes together. If you are doing foundation paper piecing for a block lotto or for a quilt bee block, you'll save yourself so many headaches if one person prints all the patterns out and then distributes them. Ask me how I know that one. Tip number 3 is to print at least 1 extra copy of the pattern. We're going to set it aside and we'll use it in the next step. So now we have our pattern, now we need to cut it out. You can use your paper scissors if you want, but you can also use a rotary blade, and I like to use one that's already on the dull side. Pattern pieces normally come with this extra 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Here is another tip. Just trim it off. You really don't need it. As we get further into the method, you'll see why. I align my ruler to the edge so that this line is totally covered by my ruler. Then following this alignment, I cut out my pattern. That way, when it's trimmed, I can still see the whole line, and I am confident of the size of my block and where I need to sew and trim. If your pattern is composed of segments, just cut them out the same way. Take your pattern pieces and lay them out. If it's a commercial pattern, it might be factory folded. So take it to the iron and just give it a good press on the low to medium setting. And definitely turn off the steam. Your pattern should have a number or a letter system on every block. Refer to that pattern's directions for what that means. For most patterns, there'll be numbers representing the order of assembly, like this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But it also may have notations for segments, like this one has A, B, C, and D. And then this one actually has a color code on the back of each one of them for what fabric is going to be used. So if you have segments that need to be assembled, ensure that you have all the pieces and you understand how it's going to be put together. Finally, we need to fold the paper on the sew lines. This is a lot easier if you have something with a low profile edge, like a greeting card or a postcard or your 3-in-1 tool. I'm just folding it on the sew lines. If you miss the edge a bit, just redo it. One last note here. Your finished piece will be the flipped image of this. This blank side is actually the front of your block. If you are assembling words or letters, they will be backwards on the pattern. If you are using a commercial pattern, you probably have a guide to what fabrics go where. If you're using your own fabrics or color story, just take a moment to look at that original pattern and figure out where the high value fabrics go and the low value fabrics go. Once you have chosen and pressed your fabrics, grab that extra pattern we printed. Make a mark inside the block edges. And on this extra pattern piece, we're going to cut each segment out, and we're going to use these as templates for our fabric. And remember, the printed side of the pattern corresponds with the wrong side of your fabric. Lay them on the wrong side of the fabric, using the shape as a guide. Cut them with a generous seam allowance. Normally, I cut them with a 3/8 or even 1/2 inch. And it doesn't matter whether you use scissors or rotary cutters. One of the benefits of using FPP is you don't really need to worry about the bias. You can cut your fabric to avoid wastage as much as possible, as your pattern is going to be the foundation that keeps it square. Now here's my next tip here. The only exception I make for this are those pieces on the outside edge of the block. These are the ones that you marked with an outline. Orient this edge to one of the grains of fabric. This will help your block stay square and not stretch as you sew all your blocks together. And often in FPP, we just need a tiny piece of some fabrics, so don't forget to check Mount Scrap more so that you can use up some scraps and remnants in this project. And it's your choice whether you cut out all your fabrics at the beginning or you cut them as you go along. On your sewing machine, set your stitch length between 1.8 and 2. Smaller stitches mean it's easier to tear away the paper at the end. And if you can't remember the last time you cleaned your machine and changed your needle, be sure to do it now. Take your first block. It might be labeled with an A, or it might just have numbers. We are looking for the piece that has the label 1. Grab some glue. You can use a water-soluble stick. You can use EPP glue, or you can use a glue roller. Flip the paper so that the plain side is up and put a dab in the middle of piece 1 and place the first fabric piece here right side up. Be sure that it's centered. Now we're going to flip that pattern back, find the line that borders piece number 2, fold the paper back, and trim it at 1/4 inch. You can use this handy 1/4 inch ruler to make the job easier. There's a lip on this that butts up to the fold in the paper, but you can also just use a regular ruler. The width of this seam is not crucial, so don't worry if it's a little bit off. Then take fabric 2 and with the right sides together, a line along the edge. Now we unfold the paper and we are going to sew along the line between 1 and 2, plus 1/4 inch on both sides. Most presser feet have a mark for the 1/4 inch, so you know where to place the line under the foot. And here's my next tip. Back up 2 stitches. My Bernina starts with a lock stitch, but if you don't have this feature, just do a couple of back stitches. Then sew along the line through paper and both fabrics, all the way to the end, plus another 1/4 inch. Then add 2 stitches and do a back stitch here too. Flip the fabric over and press. Then repeat with piece number 3. The next piece is piece number 4. Block number 4 borders piece number 2, 1, and 3. We will fold the paper back and most likely you will need to tear the paper, but don't worry, it's not precious. But this is why we do a back stitch here. When we pull the paper away from the seam, it puts a lot of stress on these stitches and sometimes they can unravel. And the back stitch prevents that. You might be thinking, won't that make the seam bulky? But there's a method in my madness because here we trim this seam at 1/4 inch. And look, all those back stitches are just trimmed off and the seam lies flat. Now align fabric number 4, sew along the seam, flip your pattern over and press. Now we repeat with pieces number 5, 6, 7, and 8. The key to this technique is to get in a rhythm. Fold, trim, align, sew, press, and repeat. This is also where the seam roller comes in handy. Instead of having to get up and go to the iron, you just roll right here in place. Having your fabric pieces prepped and ready to go also helps with your flow. Now we're going to keep the paper on as long as possible because it prevents fraying and those edges from stretching. But the block will be trimmed with 1/4 inch seam allowance. And here's my tip number 6. If your block has segments, don't trim up those outer edges until all the blocks are sewn together. Before we go to the next step, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Proven, the world's most specialized skincare. Normally at this time of year, my skin is a mess. It's dry from all the wind, the cold, and the interior heating, and irritated by scars and coats around my face. But now, after using Proven skincare products for the past 6 months, my skin feels the best that it ever has. It started last summer when I took the famous skincare genome quiz, which analyzes 47 factors about you. Your skin concerns, lifestyle, as well as your local factors like water hardness, humidity, and UV levels. And shortly after, I received a custom kit formulated just for me. It's just 3 products that were easily incorporated into my morning and evening routines. But honestly, I was shocked by how quickly it made my skin feel better. Throughout the autumn, I noticed less redness and less outbreaks. When the winter rolled around, I revisited the quiz. Because where I live, the days are shorter and colder, my answers were different than the last time. And I noticed that my winter kit was a different formulation. I actually added to my order this pack of acne dots, and I've never even had to use one. Click on the link in my description box and use my code QUILTS99 to get your first personalized Proven system for a limited time of $99. This represents a 50% discount off the retail price. The biggest challenge for most quilters is cutting and attaching the right shape and size piece. Many times it looks like your fabric is big enough only to flip it over and find that it doesn't cover the whole block or there's not enough for the seam allowance. If you used my tip number 3 and you printed an extra copy of the pattern to be used as templates, it will go a long way to solving that issue. But be aware of these 3 common mistakes. This fabric looks perfect. It's cut the correct shape for the pattern, but when it's sewn and flipped over, it's short on the seam allowance. Remember, the printed side of the pattern corresponds to the wrong side of the fabric. The plain side of the pattern corresponds with the right side of the fabric. Here we've cut the template with the correct side of the fabric, but when we sew this one together, it also does not line up. It is so easy just to lose focus for a second, and these triangles get turned around. And the third common mistake is not giving yourself a generous enough seam allowance.
Triangles are challenging at the best of times, but with these odd shapes, it's easy to be short.
Always do a test drive before you sew. A quick flip test will ensure
Is the right shape, it's oriented the right way, and it's big enough.
blocks like this tree pattern or the economy block are blocks unto themselves. And once they are pieced, you just treat them like you would any other block. But many FPP blocks are assembled from multiple segments, which can be much harder than it looks. So my next tip is, before you begin to sew these segments, assemble your pattern and put a couple of matching marks on both sides of the line where the blocks join together. These will act as reference points when you need to sew them together. Take block A and block B, trim the seam to 1/4 inch on the sides where they meet, align the reference marks that we made in the first step, use pins or clips to keep the alignment. Then sew the blocks together right along the line of the paper. Then press to the side.
Then repeat until all segments of the block are sewn together.
Then you can trim the outside edge at 1/4 inch. If you prefer not to trim off that 1/4 inch seam allowance,
then you need to be very mindful when you sew your blocks together.
Because when that seam gets pressed over, paper can get trapped underneath.
Some bits will be so awkward it will be impossible to remove them unless you trim them as you go, which is really fussy.
However, if you do trim off that 1/4 inch seam allowance like I do,
then you can leave the papers in with no worries
until the quilt top is finished, helping to keep everything nice and square. And whenever you do it, this step is messy. Paper comes off in all sorts of little bits and pieces, so have your recycling bin handy. The best tool that I have found for the job is this plastic clover stiletto. This tip is strong enough to pierce the paper and get underneath them, but not sharp enough to damage the fabrics. And this silicone tip on the other side helps lift out those tiny flakes that are hard to grab with your fingers. As you can see, there are many advantages and disadvantages with this method. First is accuracy, as long as you follow the lines. And you don't need to worry about making a perfect 1/4 inch seam, as the pattern is doing all the heavy lifting. You can use up odd-sized scraps. I was able to make this complete pillow totally from Mount Scrapmore. And you don't need to worry about biased edges stretching because of the paper foundation, which means you can attempt more intricate designs, some way above your skill level. Keeping the paper on as long as possible keeps fraying to a minimum. And it's very versatile. Even though personally I don't make a lot of full quilts made out of foundation paper piecing, I do use the technique for intricate center blocks on medallion quilts, or when I need to make an odd size block like I showed in my video on measuring hacks. I often use it in my sampler blocks
when I'm working with a lot of 1/4 square triangles.
And I find it very helpful to use when I'm sewing at a small scale. But there's also disadvantages with this method. There is a lot of waste, and it often drives me completely batty with how much I trim off. It's fiddly and fussy, especially if you cannot find a rhythm. Removing the papers is a really big step at the end when you might not have a lot of energy. And the cost of the paper is still an added expense. All seams are pressed to one side. So if you like to press your seams open, you can only do it between segments or between blocks, which means some seams can become bulky. And though all seams are pressed to the side, you don't get to choose what side. So if you're using light colors like white, you'll want to have your light fabric overlapping that seam a bit, so a dark edge does not appear. So are you going to give foundation paper piecing a try? Give me a thumbs up down in the comments below if you are. Paper piecing, like all quilting techniques, requires time and practice to master. So don't be discouraged if your first block isn't perfect. If you would like your own copy of the
Evergreen tree pattern,
you can download it from my website at justgetitdonequilts.com/block patterns. I'll leave the direct link in the video notes below. You'll also find a link for the economy block. 3 different ways, 3 different sizes. This video is first in a series on paper piecing. Still to come is the freezer paper method, large scale paper piecing, how to make your own foundation paper piece pattern, fussy cut FPP, and quilt as you go FPP. So stay tuned. Take care, and I'll see you next time.